our next lecturer. Our next lecturer is Hamish Anderson, and he is one of London's most celebrated wine experts, having won many awards for the renowned Tate Britain cellar. Tate Modern in London capitalized on this by making him responsible for all of their wine buying. Smart move. Hamish also recently set up Tate's very own coffee roasting operation, which is a big deal. In 2003, Hamish published the book Vino, Great Wine for Everyday Life. The book's down-to-earth approach has won praise from both amateur and expert alike. Right now, Hamish will speak about terroir and blending in wine. We also have some wine for you in front of you to taste during the lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, a big, warm welcome for Hamish Anderson.
That's it. Thank you very much. You're an obedient lot, and I know you've had a long day. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for asking me. I feel a bit of an interloper here, a sort of snake in the grass, talking about wine in the coffee world. Before I get on to the main part of my lecture, it's probably just worth me recapping to sort of tell you how I got to this point and a little bit about coffee with Tate, because that's really informed what I'm going to talk about today. I was smiling wryly earlier when René was talking about how coffee sits within restaurants. And the situation in 2000 was very much how he described when I took over the general wine buying and actually the general drinks buying for the Tate when we opened Tate Modern. My training was as a sommelier, and then when we opened Tate Modern, we suddenly found ourselves with 4 sites, and then we swiftly opened another site as well. So they kind of wanted someone to look after all the drinks buying. So having only really done the wine before, they said, well, why don't you do the soft drinks and everything else? And I said, well, I quite like to do coffee as well. I didn't really know anything about coffee at the time. And chefs, traditionally, I don't know if it's the same in this country, but traditionally in the UK, coffee sits within the P&L of food. So chefs are a bit reluctant to give up coffee because coffee produces a nice big margin and they don't have to do very much and makes their food gross profit margins look a lot better. They don't have to get any chefs out the front making it. They get a sort of lowly paid barman to do that and then reap all the benefits for it. So I decided to take over the coffee, and we now actually within Tate run coffee as a separate, so hot drinks, coffee and tea as a separate bit within our P&L. So we decided to make coffee sort of quite an important part of what we were doing. We worked for a long time with one of the big sort of Italian brands of coffee, and I used to take staff out there to Italy, and we used to taste it and do training and see how it was made and all that kind of stuff. And the thing that kept on coming up the whole time when I was doing that, and we worked with them for sort of 8 or 9 years, was this idea that blending, particularly for making espresso and cappuccino, was the best way forward. And all I heard about in coffee was blending. Then, as has been said, a couple of years ago, we had someone who was working within our business for a long time, who's always had a passion for coffee, and he came to us with the idea of setting up our own roastery. We now have 7 sites around the country, based mostly in London. And so we started it in November last year, so it's been running sort of 7 or 8 months now, and it's a great success. But the interesting thing for me, when I started to taste coffee with Ben, who's the guy that runs the coffee roastery for us, was really getting away from this idea that you know, the blend was the be-all and the end-all, and actually starting to do some cupping. I mean, I've only really done cupping 2 or 3 times, so it was really interesting to do the cupping out there today. But really be able to taste these coffees from single sites and see how really incredibly different they tasted. And also to see how the coffee world really sort of embracing those single estates and actually selling them and marketing them as something good in their own right. Because this mirrors something that's been going on in the wine world for sort of really a long time, which essentially the wine world has sort of gone from being sort of mostly single site to being sort of blending, being very much in fashion. And we're now really very much the boot is on the other foot. Terroir and the idea of site-specific is really very much in vogue and very much in fashion. I'm not here today to sort of tell you that the VS bit in my title, the versus, is probably where I'm coming from today. And I'm not here to sort of tell you that terroir wines are better than blended wines, or indeed that blended wines are better than terroir wines. I'm really here to just sort of provoke a little bit of thought and hopefully give you my thoughts on it. First of all, I think it's useful just to clarify what I mean about blended wine. Blended wine can obviously be a blend of grape varieties, but it's also probably more importantly what we're talking about today, a blend across regions. You can have, to me, a very terroir-specific wine, so a very site-specific wine that comes from a blend of grape varieties. So on the hills, on the side of Mount Etna, you can get 10 different grape varieties, all planted together, all in a very small spot. To me, that's a very terroir, site-specific focus wine. Also, you can have, a blended wine that comes from thousands of miles apart. That is the polar opposite. That is the extreme. It was interesting. I've been on holiday last week, and I left holiday a day early to come out here. And I was with a group of friends who were all sort of reasonably keen wine people. They like food, and they're quite into. They're sort of, I would say, our target audience here. And I was explaining what my talk was about. And I explained the idea of blending, and they sort of went, well, that sort of sounds okay. And then when you talk to them about the idea of terroir, most of them kind of heard of terroir. I wasn't quite sure what it is. But the idea that you can tie a wine or a food or a coffee or a tea down to a really specific place, and that specific place really has something to say, that really resonated with them. And I think that's where we're at in the wine world at the moment. Terroir is very much in fashion. People enjoy it and like it, and it's an easy message to get across to the consumer. And blending maybe is a little bit down. People are a little bit snotty about blending. But there's really not an awful lot of black and white when you're talking about terroir and blended wines. As I said, you can go from that one extreme of a very small site-specific place through to what I would call wines that we're going to try some of them later, that I would call blended wines. We're going to try a Rioja, which is a Rioja from a blend of grape varieties, but also more importantly a blend within the Rioja region. We're also going to try a Champagne. And then you also have regions like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, which technically you would maybe classify as blended wines. But there are also wines that are very distinct. Champagne tastes like champagne and nothing else, and it's very hard to replicate that anywhere else in the world. So even though you have a very large area, you can still pin down certain distinct tastes to those quite large areas. It's probably worth noting also that certain different grape varieties have a sort of propensity to be blended, and others stand alone. Things like Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. We're going to try 2 Chardonnays later on. Probably that, along with Riesling, is the great sort of grape variety, white grape varieties to stand alone. And then for reds, you have things like sort of Pinot Noir and Syrah. But anyway, moving on. There's 3 reasons really that I think that you blend wine. Why do you choose to blend wine? And the first, at the most basic level, is economics. The huge expansion in wine, both in production and in people consuming wine over the last 10 to 15 or 20 years really, has really necessitated blending and made blending much, much more important. I was tasting a whole load of range of wines from Jacob's Creek the other day, the big Australian producer, and a lot of their wines fall under something, a GI, what we call a geographic indicator, something called Southeastern Australia. And this encompasses most of South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, and some of Queensland as well. To give you an idea, Brisbane to Adelaide is about 2,000 kilometres. So you're taking grapes from very, very different areas and blending them together. And that blend that you end up with is something that really doesn't have anything left of the sites that it's come from. It really is about creating something at a price point. It's about buying things in from different places and creating something that you need to sell at a certain price point. And it's probably those types of wines that have actually given blending a really bad name. The second reason that you might blend, which is certainly linked to the first one, but it's to me quite distinctly different because it's much more quality-led, is consistency. Now, I think it's very easy when we are talking about wine, and indeed I'm sure it's the same true of coffee as well, there's a danger that we can see where we're at today is the be-all and end-all, and where we are today is we are producing the best wines possible than we've ever done. And we don't look back and see what history has sort of taught us. I mean, wine has gone from being, sort of 2,000 years ago, the Romans were writing about wine, and I came back from Campania, which is sort of in southern Italy not very long ago, the area around Mount Vesuvius. People wrote about the wines there 2,000 years ago, and they talked about them, and we even know from Pliny the Elder that in 121 BC was a cracking vintage, apparently. It was served in a Roman banquet 60 years after it was produced for Julius Caesar. So, even then, 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, people were talking about wine coming from a specific place and aging it, much like we do today. They then used to add honey to it as well, which slightly detracts from the, from the quality argument. But at least this wine, which was called Falernian wine, was still famous 400 years later. And then what happened as wine sort of evolved and wine started to be traded, particularly traded around Europe, the idea of consistency became much, much more important. Because what you had then is you started to have companies taking wine, selling it and trading it. And companies became the important thing. You bought a wine because a company, and you could trust that company. And that, in effect, was the sort of birth of brands within wine. And I think, you know, if you think of the examples of the sort of classic European wines, things like port, Madeira, sherry, champagne, all those wines, at some element or another, are blended. And you can even argue that some things like Bordeaux and Burgundy, I mean, Burgundy, we're going to try a couple of Burgundies later on. It's only really in the last sort of 50 years that Burgundy has become very, very obsessed about being so site-specific. Some of the famous, really famous top Grand Crus were indeed bottled on their own 50 or 60 years ago, but more often than not, a lot of the villages were just sort of slightly blended together, so you would have Nuits Saint-Georges or Vosne-Romanée or Chablis, rather than getting down really to the single individual site. And the last reason that you blend is probably the most interesting one, and this is the one where I think you're crossing almost more of a philosophical barrier here, is absolute quality. And this is about, if you want to go and make the best wine you possibly can, no holds bars, no expense, is it about going to produce a wine from one specific site, one specific terroir, or is it about actually blending? And again, I've talked a little bit about port and champagne, but you get some examples in the New World, things like Penfolds, Grange, Hermitage, where the Australians have always been one of the leaders in blending wine. And they're very much viewed, not totally today, because a lot more people are looking at site specifics, but some of those really famous wines from Australia are created by blending. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's a bit like creating a dish. You're taking a little bit of acidity maybe from one area, you're taking a little bit of tannin from another area, you're taking some ripe fruit from another area, and you're kind of blending those together and trying to create something which is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think port is a particularly interesting example of this. If you think about what is the apogee in port, what is the top wines in port, it's vintage port. And vintage port is blended from across the Douro Valley. And if anyone's been to the Douro Valley, they'll know it's an incredibly beautiful place, steep-sided hillsides, lots of little tributaries of a river. It's a sort of terroir heaven, really. I mean, you can get loads of different sites all tasting subtly different. And what they've chosen to do there for many years is blend all those together to make their top wine. And it's interesting that in years that are not seen to be the top years, a lot of the estates will reduce a site-specific wine, a single Quinta wine, which is deemed not such high quality as the vintage wine. We're moving on. We're staying on schedule. We're now, before they get too warm, going to taste the first two of the wines that I've got in front of you here. And I'm going to talk... Yes, sorry, wine, they're numbered on the sheet, so you should have wine number 1. We're going to taste the fizz and the red wine first. Before we taste, I must say that I go to lots of wine fairs, and most wine fairs are quite staid, boring things, and this day here has already been more interesting than most wine fairs I go to. At wine fairs, you never get offered beer at lunch. And secondly, you would never have a tasting like this without a spittoon. I was deeply impressed when no spittoons were even talked about. So I'm going to come to a lot more coffee fairs in future and a lot less wine fairs. Okay, so what I'm kind of trying to show you here is two wines. These are, for me, the two blended wines we're going to be tasting. And we're then going to taste two very site-specific terroir wines later on. And what I'm trying to show you here is that both Champagne and Rioja are classically seen as blended wines. But both of these two wines, while being blended, have also a lot of terroir influence in them. The first wine, which is the Champagne, sorry, I'll put it up on the screen for you so you can see it. Le Mondier-Bernier Tradition, Premier Cru Extra Brut. Just to dispense with the sort of rubbish on the label to start off with, because Champagne has lots of stuff on the label. Le Mondier-Bernier is the name of the producer. Tradition doesn't really mean anything at all. It just means this is their sort of basic cuvée. Premier Cru means that this comes from vineyards which have been classified within Champagne as either Premier Cru. This actually has a lot of Grand Cru vineyards in it as well. So that's the kind of base level, the lowest level. And probably the most important thing for me on this label when thinking about terroir is that it's extra brut. I'm not going to bore you too much with the technical details of making champagne, but when you finish making champagne, the last thing you do before you bottle it is you add something called dosage, which is a bit of sugar and a bit of sweetness. Extra brut means it has quite a low level of sugar added to it. And to me, sugar is a great way within champagne of masking poor quality grapes, and it also masks terroir. So the best producers like Lys, Lemondier, Bernier are now really reducing the dosage, the sugar levels. This is a blend of grape varieties, so it's 90% Chardonnay and it's 10% Pinot Noir. It's a blend of sites. So what I'm showing you here, traditionally, we'll get onto a map of Champagne in a moment and you can see. But this wine comes from mostly all from the Côte de Blanc. Where the Côte de Blanc, as the name would sound, is where most of the white wine, the best white grapes are grown in Champagne. And it's a blend of different villages. I've put the villages down there. But the important thing here is it's about 20 to 30 kilometres apart, all these different villages and all these different sites. So we're not talking about one specific tiny site here. We're talking about a range of villages and a range of grape varieties. And perhaps the unique thing really for Champagne is that this is a blend of vintages as well. So this current release is about 70% of the 2008 vintage, and then it's about 30% reserve wine, so older wines. So going back to what I was saying earlier about how consistency is incredibly important for blending, the reason they really came up with this in Champagne was to produce a consistent product. 2008 was not a very good year in Champagne, so if you were just making a single vintage each year, you'd end up with not a very good wine in 2008. And by having that ability to back blend, you create something rather good. And when you taste this, there's sort of a couple of things I want you to look for when you try this. I don't like to tell people too much what they should try and find in wine, because I think it's probably a bit like coffee as well. When you tell people that there's berries in there, they immediately start tasting them. But the things to look out for here is this real dominance of Chardonnay, and this wine really sort of reeks of the Côte de Blanc to me. And it's that kind of citrusy, lemony, creamy kind of character in the wine, which is very much the Chardonnay coming through. And also that nice kind of sort of steely, sort of mineral freshening kind of character, which comes partly from, we'll talk a little bit more about the limestone soils it's grown on. Right, so that's the Champagne. We're going to move on because I can see we're behind schedule already. I think you came in late, so I think I've got a bit of grace, have I? Excellent. Right, and just so you can see on the map here, that's a blank page. I'm just going to point a little bit. So where we are here, you can see that the Champagne region is a large region. Where's my pointer? The wine you've just tasted from here, Vertus, which is about the lowest village, and you were tasting villages basically moving up there, which in Champagne terms, for blending in Champagne, is a very small area. Traditionally, you'd be taking grapes from all over the place. So this, to me, is a blended wine, but a blended wine with a very distinct terroir coming through in it. So anyway, the second wine we're going to try is 2007 Muga Reserva, which is a Rioja. And again, just to dispense with the stuff on the label, Muga is the name of the estate, and Reserva is a classification for its aging. Reserva means that it has to be aged for 3 years before it can be released, and at least one of those years has to be aging in oak barrels, and then has to be aged for a further couple of years in bottles as well. This, again, interesting thing about this is a blend of grape varieties. So it's Tempranillo, which is the main grape variety in Rioja. In fact, it's quite unusual to have such a high proportion of other grape varieties apart from Tempranillo. You have Garnacha, which is Grenache, Mazuelo, and Graciano, which are both typical grapes of Rioja used in quite small quantities. And again, a little bit like the last wine that we tried, this comes from a blend of regions. I'll just take you on here. My maps, for some reason, seem to be mismade. But Rioja is divided into 3 main regions. Muga are based in Alta up here. Alta is a little higher, as the name implies, and it produces slightly sort of denser, more structured styles of wine. But although they're based there, they're taking grapes from other regions as well. So Alvesa, which produces a little more perfume and a little more delicacy in the wine. But the thing to look out for really here, when you go to Rioja, they talk very much about the climate there, and they talk a lot about continental and Atlantic vintages. Continental vintages tend to be the warmer vintages, so you have these slightly riper wines. And the Atlantic vintages, they tend to talk about being slightly cooler when the Atlantic influence dominates a little bit more. And I'll talk a little bit more about weather later on. But this is from 2007, which is a cooler year. So when you taste the wine, you're going to see a little bit more acidity in the wine. It's not as rich and full-bodied as some of those hotter years. And you certainly, to me, get some of that outer kind of structure coming through, a little bit of that tannin, a little bit of grip on the wine when you taste it. I can see someone wincing over there. But you definitely, a Rioja really, for me, to go with food. It's not that sort of soft and generous style of Rioja. And that's like, that structure is quite, as I said, quite typical of Alta. The last thing to mention about the Rioja is that some of the taste and some of the flavour you get in there is very much the way that the wine is aged. So this is aged in oak barrels, but the really specific thing about Rioja, which is typical, aging in oak barrels, typical of many red wines, most red wines, but in Rioja they use a lot of American oak barrels, which gives some of this sort of sweet, spicy, vanilla kind of character to the wine. Right, we're going to get on to terroir now. Now, to me, I have a 5-year-old son, and my 5-year-old son, whenever he wants to know anything, he's always asking me incessant questions the whole time. I drive along the car, he's always asking me. And if I can't provide the answers to him, he says, "Google it, Dad, Google it." So I decided before I did this lecture to Google terroir. And as you can imagine, terroir, you get pages, reams and reams of things about terroir. Coffee, tea, wine. And each person's site, blog, Wikipedia, whatever you look at will tell you something slightly different. And so I'm going to give you my sort of slightly potted history of what I think terroir is, but there will be a lot of people out there who'll disagree with me, so don't take what I tell you as gospel. To me, terroir is something that is outside the control of man. So it is something that, whether it's the soil, the geography, the topography, it is outside the control of man. There's one slight caveat which I'll get to later on. And it's interesting that terroir, the real rise of terroir, has come at the time when we're very much more interested in locality, things being sourced locally, natural wine, which I'm sure some of you know a little bit about, the interest in organics and biodynamics. All these things have come along at the same time as a sort of a much greater interest and understanding of terroir. Again, because I'm quite interested in history, so I've given you the Roman side of my blending. But the term terroir is sort of evolved over the years, and it really first, by all accounts, it was only first really used in the 17th century. And it was used as part of a phrase, which was goût de terroir, literally taste of the earth. And for quite a long time, it wasn't actually seen as that complimentary. And I can even remember one of my sort of formative people who got me interested in wine was married to my godmother. And I remember when I used to taste wine with him at quite a young age, 18, he was a really traditional, old-school English sort of wine guy. And if we tasted a particularly sort of earthy, somebody sort of really feral wine, he would go, "Oh, goût de terroir, you know, that's really good." And it wasn't a term until quite recently that was really used to describe the sort of finest and most elegant styles of wine. It was really seen as that idea of the taste of the earth. And it wasn't really till the 19th century there was sort of bon viveur called Dr. Morello. In those days, all bon viveurs were doctors. Doctors, I think, had the best life. Really started using the terminology and applying it to Burgundy, because he noted in Burgundy, where you have really a sort of terroir heaven nowadays, that people were making wine in pretty much exactly the same way, but wine tasted, each vineyard tasted really quite differently. So he really applied that term, and that's really from then onwards that it started to be used as a term of a good wine. As I said, factors outside of human control is my definition of it. The first of those is soil, and there's two areas here that I'm going to go through quite quickly, actually. And the first is water retention, and the second is heat retention. Traditionally, when I first started hearing about terroir, I got into wine in the mid-90s, there was this kind of idea that the vine somehow sucked out the minerals from the ground. And the reason that Chablis, which we're going to try later, tasted very fresh and minerally was because somehow these minerals were coming up into the vine. That idea is kind of, people are still doing research on it, but the idea now really has moved away from that, how soil affects the taste of wine. And the most important thing is really water retention. And we're going to look at a couple of soils later on. But if you imagine the limestone soils of Chablis that we're going to taste later, they act a bit like a sponge. They soak water up, but they also don't get too waterlogged. And it's about delivering just the right amount of water to the vine. Vines that have a lot of water will produce quite big berries with quite thin skins, but they'll also produce quite a lot of foliage as well. So you give a plant a lot of water and it essentially grows. If you stress a plant out and give it too little water, or just the right amount of little water, you tend to get more concentrated berries with thicker skins, which is really what you're looking for when you're looking for soil. And the other interesting thing about soil, is probably thought of a little bit less, is heat retention. In some of the cooler areas, particularly important in the UK, where we're trying to grow some grapes now, but other places like the Moselle, where you have these great sort of granitic, schisty soils, which are quite dark. They warm up during the day, they retain the heat, and then they reflect that heat at night, ripening the grapes. That's probably the best example of grapes being warmed by stones, galets stones in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So these big white stones in the vineyard, they heat up during the day and they reflect heat, ripening the grapes. And then Chablis, we'll taste those later, but there's these limestone soils in Chablis. Next thing is topography, so really low geography, but a bit expanded on geography. So altitude is very important in thinking about terroir. Obviously, the higher you are, you tend to get slightly, quite, depending on where you are actually, but warmer, but cool nights. And also in places like Mendoza in Argentina, you get very high vineyards. The high UV tends to affect how the grapes taste as well. Exposure is pretty obvious, whether your vineyard is facing south, east, west, depending on how much sun the vineyard is going to get. And probably quite an interesting one is local landmarks, which people don't really think about too often. I think that I went to a vineyard in Beaujolais not very long ago, and the guy told me there he had a little walled vineyard, and just that walled vineyard, by being protected from the wind, made the grapes taste very, very different to the open vineyard, because the grapes weren't being stressed out by the wind. So little things like that can really make a big difference. Things like large bodies of water as well, rivers, they tend to protect against frost, and so forth. Probably for me, we're going to get onto here, one of the greatest examples of terroir and topography is the Vosges Mountains, which are up in Alsace. You can just see them there in the background. And what they do, if you think about where Alsace is, it's quite far north in France, pretty much sort of parallel with Paris. And it's essentially, you would think, too cool a region to really ripen grapes properly. But you have these Vosges Mountains here. The prevailing weather hits the mountains first, basically rains on the mountains, so you get an enormous amount of sunshine in Alsace. Alsace shares with Roussillon, right down in the south, the most sunshine hours in France. And so that's really an example of terroir. It's not really affecting the taste, but it's actually giving you ability to be able to make and grow grapes there in the first place. You wouldn't otherwise be able to grow grapes there. And the Moselle, again, we talked a little, I've referred to those already, the steep-sided there, the river there, you can see, has a profound effect on those lower vineyards, protecting them from frost by moving body of water, keeping the air flowing. Climate, again, a lot of this is very similar to coffee, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. You have three sort of elements to climate. Macroclimate, which is really the larger area. If you think about Bordeaux, you would talk about the macroclimate, the climate of Bordeaux being a maritime climate. It's quite influenced by the sea. Mesoclimate's more local. Again, referring back to Bordeaux, you would think about something like Saint-Estèphe, one of the regions within Bordeaux. It's quite close to the sea, so it's a little bit cooler than some of the other areas. And then the microclimate, which really is right down to the individual vineyard, and that's the guy growing the grapes in one vineyard whose 1 year a hailstorm comes through and wipes out his vineyard, and only 50, 60 metres to the left, the other guy's fine. Really gets down to that very small level. The last thing, before we get on to tasting the last two wines, this is probably my only controversial take on terroir, which is yeast. I'll put that question mark because a lot of people don't see this as part of terroir. This is something that increasingly more and more people are doing, which is wild fermenting their wines. There is yeast, as I'm sure you all know, around us in the air. Traditionally, and particularly traditionally, a lot of the larger producers would use inoculated yeast. And this was really brought home to me when I visited New Zealand a few years ago and tasted through a range of New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs. And you would think of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc as an area that really had terroir because it has that really distinct taste. I think it's one of the easiest wines to taste and understand. And I tasted through with a producer there who was utilising lots of different yeast strains, and he vinified 10 or 15 different wines with different strains of yeast and one with wild fermentation. And he actually really demonstrated to me that a lot of the flavour that you get from Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc is actually down to the yeast that they're selecting to use and not actually the area. And so increasingly, as people use wild fermentation, that impacts because those yeast are specific to each specific area. And that applies to many things, not just wine. If you think of San Francisco's sourdough bread, for instance, that tastes specifically like that because of the yeast that are around there in the quite foggy area in San Francisco. I have run on very slightly. Let's get on to two more wines to finish up with. Right, you're going to have to concentrate a little bit now. You made me do some blind coffee tasting, so I'm going to make you do some blind wine tasting. I'm going to give you literally 2 minutes just to taste these two wines. Both these two wines are Chablis, and both these two wines come from different vineyards within Chablis. The only thing I want you to do is actually decide which wine you like the most for my interest's sake, and I'm going to take a show of hands, and I'm then going to tell you a little bit about where they come from. So wine number 3 I would probably have a go at first, and then move on to wine number 4. Lots of slurping going on. I've got to take it very seriously. Right. Has everyone tasted those wines? Can I have a show of hands for number 3 first? Number 3 first. Okay, that's about half and half. I'm hoping that those of you who don't have your hand up like the other wine. Yep. Number 4. Oh, I think number 4 kind of wins slightly. So number 3, you're the sort of acid freaks because you like a lot of acidity, because that wine has a lot more acidity than the second wine. I wanted to show you these two wines because this to me really illustrates terroir. Both these wines are made by the same producer. The labels, we'll go on to the labels in 1 second. But the first wine that you tried is Chablis. So Chablis is the region, Premier Cru. So Burgundy has come up with the most arcane collection of appellation rules, but basically Premier Cru is an individual vineyard site. This vineyard is called Vauquepin, and Domaine Baru is the name of the producer. It's quite a small Premier Cru, this. Very steep slope. It's southeast facing, and it's on what we call the right bank of the Seran. So there's a river that runs through the Chablis. And the right bank wines, this wine actually doesn't taste like a right bank wine. I'll tell you a bit about that and more. It's incredibly rocky, this vineyard, and very free draining soils there. And then the second wine, to me, I put very fine, very pure Chablis, very typical Chablis, I think. And the second wine is Chablis Premier Cru Monte de Tonnerre. It's not actually the name Athonay. You might think it's not the same producer, but it is the same producer. This is what's called a négociant wine, so they don't actually own the land that the wine, the grapes are grown on, whereas the previous wine they did. This wine here has a slightly better exposure, and I think when you taste this wine, those of you who like this wine more, you'll see it has a little bit more flesh, it's a little bit more honeyed, it's a little bit more opulent, and it's actually quite good tasting these wines a little bit warm. You'd probably drink these wines a little bit cooler if you were having them at home, but it really shows the differences between the two. Lots of sun there, slightly heavier soil, and you get a lot more. This vineyard is famous for having a lot more weight and a lot more ripeness than the last one. I'll just show you where those two are on the map, just so you can... So, we're really not very far apart at all here. Look at the scale up there. We're 1 kilometre. So Monte de Tonnerre is there, and Vauquepin is there. So they're about 2 kilometres apart. Vinified in exactly the same way. These wines are made with wild yeast. Those of you who've got the bottom of the bottle might find a little bit of sludge in your wines. These wines are what we call unfined and unfiltered, so they're literally opening the barrel and putting them pretty much straight in the bottle. So they're about as sort of kind of unmessed with as you can get. what you're tasting there really is the difference between the vineyards, that really sort of pure, high tensile, acidic Vauquepin, and then that slightly more generous, rounded Monte de Tonnerre. I've definitely run over, so I think that... No, you keep going. Look at all this wine we have left. Anyway, no, I'm going to throw the floor open to a few questions now. But really, the point that I'm really trying to make, and I put it up at the end here, is that, you know, there should be no... no, probably that's it. That's Tim's fault. Tim couldn't get the machine running early. But the point I was really trying to make is that there really shouldn't be this sort of this kind of friction between terroir and blending. The two very much coexist. And if anything, at the moment, I think people are talking a little bit too much about terroir, and we should be thinking a little bit more about how blending and the two can really come together to create the best wines possible. Thank you very much indeed. And,
all right, any questions in the room? Okay, here I come.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi there.
We talked a lot about blending in wine.
Yep.
But do you think it's strange that you blend at the chateau, but it's unheard of to blend after you have the bottles in a bar, for instance? Have you ever blended 2 bottles of wine in one glass?
That's a very good question. The first job that I ever had in wine, I used to work in a hotel in France, and when we used to run out of rosé, we used to blend the white and the red together. I don't think that really counts. Yes, I mean, I have tasted with producers. It's an interesting question, this. I was with a young producer in Burgundy about 2 years ago. And as I alluded to, Burgundy is really the sort of, you know, people who really love terroir and like site-specific wines, you sort of go to Burgundy. And I was with a very young producer there, and he was sort of hypothesizing about, you know, if you went to Burgundy now and there was nothing there, and you planted vineyards now, would we still, you know, do what we're doing now? Because there's some sites, undoubtedly, I think, in Burgundy that would be better if they were blended with another wine. And I actually did that. This is a producer in Santenay, which is one of the sort of less fashionable regions in Burgundy. And we started to blending together from the bottle some of his Premier Crus. And, you know, the wines were different. I wouldn't say one was better than the other, but a lot of it's a mindset, I think. So I don't think there's any reason why you couldn't take bottles and blend them together. And indeed, a number of top estates now, I can think of someone like Vega Sicilia in the Ribera del Duero. You know, they make a wine now which is a multi-vintage blend, and there's another couple of people who are doing it in Italy as well. I think it's more of kind of, you know, people like to get a bottle of wine and you know, they've paid that money for it. They're not necessarily then want to mix it with someone else. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Other questions?
I have another question here.
Yeah.
Hamish, firstly, I thought that was wonderful and
Thank you.
very insightful. I actually want to ask you a question that's not really on what you talked about, but actually more about accessibility.
Yep.
For people who, say, want to get into wine, who maybe find that there's a level of expectation that's a barrier to actually getting involved with wine at all.
Mm.
What you've come up against, say, yourself in the wine industry, and maybe what the coffee industry can learn from that in terms of alienating customers and trying to be more inclusive?
It's a very good question, and I certainly wouldn't say that the wine world has cracked that, because I mean, if you look what's happening to the wine world in the UK, to me it's becoming increasingly polarised, much more polarised than it was 15 years ago. Sorry, excuse me, when I got involved in wine. You're having, you know, the $5.99 wine that is dominating the supermarket shelf is becoming a bigger and bigger market share. The little guys in the middle are getting really squeezed out. And then you have 5 or 8% of the consumers who are really engaged with wine. And those increasingly are the people that I find myself talking to. And I think it's a struggle actually for wine to sort of break down. There's a lot of people who drink wine who are not really terribly engaged with wine. And I imagine that's the same thing in coffee as well. I mean, I find that within our restaurants, I mean, to give you a little bit of context about our restaurants, I know that you've been to them. But I find when I started opening Tate Modern, I took a lot of the things that had worked there from Tate Britain. And Tate Britain, we have a wine list with 500 wines on it. We have quite an educated wine consumer who comes in. We have staff who come to work there because they know the wine list is good. And I tried to take some of those elements that have worked really well there and replicate them in Tate Modern, which was a completely different audience, and it really didn't work at all well. So I think sometimes the coffee world can maybe think about, you know, you have to take one or two elements of those things that work well in your slightly more highbrow market, and then transfer maybe one or two and just do one at a time rather than trying to do 7 or 8, because the consumer just needs a little hook to get them going rather than a whole raft of information to start off with.
Other questions?
I have a question about regarding marketing, like the branding on bottles.
Yep.
I know that some companies had made like headway selling poor quality wines with, you know, kind of dumbing down the labels and not speaking about the legacy or any of the information.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering what trends you've seen with actual quality wine and what information they're sharing on the bottle and what consumers want to see on the bottle.
I'd almost slightly revert a little bit back to what I was saying there, in the sense that the wine market is becoming so polarised. In one sense, wine labels are becoming a lot simpler and really pared back. And of course, the great change we've seen in the wine world in the last 25, 30 years is really the brand has become less associated with area and terroir and site specificity. If you ask most consumers, certainly in the UK, to name 5 wines, they would probably come up with 4 grape varieties, and then they might come up with Chablis or Sancerre or something like that as well. So I think branding has become much more about single varietals and grapes, and that has made the message very, very simple, which is good in one sense, but in another sense it doesn't really ask too much from the consumer, in the sense of sort of telling them to, you know, well, you need to learn a little bit more to be able to decipher this label. So any labels, particularly those labels like the Chablis labels that we had up here, it's a struggle for a lot of people to, unless you're really interested in wine or have a sommelier to tell you about it, to understand what you're going to get from the bottle.
Tim?
In saying all of that, what we tend to do on coffee labels is put tasting notes.
Yep.
Do you think that that's a step in the right direction, or maybe misleading for the...
I'd say I think it's a step in the right direction, but funnily enough, we were just doing, Ben and I, who Tim knows I work at the Tate with, who runs all the coffee for us at the Tate, and we're just starting to retail our coffee through the retail outlets in the Tate. And him and I were having a big argument about what we should put on the label of our coffee label. Because I think, and I alluded to it slightly in my tasting there, I don't like to be too prescriptive with people about what they should be, specific flavours that they should be finding in wine. And I find that if you tell someone that they should be finding pineapple or vanilla or very specific flavours, if they don't find those, they either think that they're not a very good wine taster and that sort of specialty wine is not necessarily for them, or it slightly reinforces the notion that sort of wine is talking a slightly different language that no one else understands. I prefer on my wine lists and some of the wines that we create and blend ourselves to try and tell a story. You know, if the estate that the wines come from is particularly interesting, it's got a little bit of history around it, I don't know, the winemaker's got a pink dog or whatever, those are the kind of things that actually kind of hook in the consumer that doesn't really know a lot about it in the first place, and then you can get on to the sort of, you know, the terroir and the full tasting notes. But it's just that they need kind of one little hook that, for me, it often is a story, and that's, again, how we train our staff a lot as well.
Other questions, please?
Hamish, my
sorry.
questions are regarding like regulation in the wine industry.
Yep.
In Australia, it's very regulated, and winemakers have to fill out, you know, massive forms.
Yep.
And, I was wondering if you think that in the coffee industry, if it's worthy to have the same sort of regulation to try and be a bit more accurate with our labelling and what we're roasting, or if that's perhaps not a road to go down.
I think for a certain small section of consumers, it's very relevant because people want to know and believe. You know, if you think about wine, for years people sold wine on the basis that it came from Champagne, or I was going back to talking about the Romans. You know, they had wine and they promoted it in certain areas. It wasn't really till the 30s in Europe that people set down laws, and those laws are one designed for quality control, but really for kind of brand protection. So I'd say laws and regulations are good, I think, if you feel a brand is being impinged because other people are kind of trading off you. If you're saying, you know, this particular coffee from that area is absolutely fantastic, if you lay down regulations to say a bit like an appellation system for wine, I think that would be a good thing. But there's a great danger that, you know, kind of confusing and you know, sort of trying to do a little bit too much before people have really got an understanding of the basics, I think.
I have a question. I think the interesting thing that you've discussed quite a bit is the sort of stratification in both of our industries, where you have certain markets that you're aiming for, and you need to really deal with those markets in a clear-sighted and a conscious way for delivering the message. Even though I think it probably excites you most to build the list at Tate Britain, because that's where fantastic wine lives. Tell us how you get excited about building the list at Tate Modern.
Well, that's a very good question, actually, because when we opened Tate Modern, I didn't think that list would be so exciting for me, but I actually find it more challenging and probably more interesting. Taking aside the fact that actually that generates 50% of our revenue as well. So out of the 7 sites we have, it's incredibly important for us as a business to get that area really right. What I would say there, the biggest lesson I've learned there is less is more. Just it's learning as a wine guy, because you know we can get so obsessive about wine. I could create a wine list with 2001 wines on it if I wanted to. You know, there's a great danger of going, oh, I just need another one of those, and I need another one. Oh, yeah, I can't have it without having one of those. And Tate Modern really taught me in a high-volume restaurant. You know, the first lists I put in there were too big. They were a little bit too complicated. We have a large group of staff there, quite a high staff turnover. So, you know, it taught me to be very focused and you know, try and do things interesting and have interesting things on the list, but that has to be balanced by a commercial side as well.
That's great. Other questions?
Hi. As coffee professionals, we're really good at getting into a box and staying in it. And
wine people are excellent at that as well.
Yeah, cellar palette and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I was wondering, although you're not a complete outsider because you do a fair bit of coffee as well, what do you think from a wine perspective that the coffee industry could do better? Go hard. Don't hold back.
What do I think the coffee industry? That's a very good question. A little bit of what I was just saying there. I think you need to, as an industry, you need to kind of engage in very small steps with people, with the consumer. If you want someone to get to here and be discussing single-site coffee and be really interesting about what temperature you're putting this in and pressing that with and all that kind of stuff, you need to hook them along slowly on the way. It's very, very hard to get someone to come from just being a person who goes into Starbucks or drinks instant coffee at home, who is a coffee consumer, and we have the same audience within wine. There's a huge raft of people who drink wine. I think this is where the wine industry has slightly gone wrong, in the sense that I'm kind of in my 40s now, but it was my kind of generation that really drove the increase in consumption in wine in the UK 20 years ago. And there was a great assumption that, you know, if we just got people to drink wine, then the next step they would then get suddenly very interested in finer wine, and they would start spending more and they would engage more. That hasn't happened greatly, and I think part of that problem is that the way that wine is talked about has been too highbrow, too complicated for that person that really actually at the end of the day wants a nice bottle of wine to have at home each night. And I think coffee, again, has to be careful not to try and sort of run before it can walk.
All right. Another round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you.